It happened during the speeches. My cousin had just finished thanking everyone for coming when Aunt Marlene lifted her glass and looked straight at me. She was smiling, but not warmly. "You look more like Martin every year," she said. The room went quiet. My mother's hand froze around her wine glass. My father looked down at his plate, and my brother stared at the floor like he already knew exactly what she meant. Then Aunt Marlene added, softer this time, "Funny how nobody ever talks about that." That was the first time I understood something. I hadn't been adopted. I had been hidden. My name is Adeline Townsend. I'm 30 years old, and for most of my life, I believed I was adopted. That was the story my parents told me, and the one I never questioned. Until one sentence, spoken by someone who wasn't supposed to say anything, made me realize something didn't add up. Because if I wasn't adopted, then what exactly had they been hiding from me all these years? I grew up in a house where everything felt structured. Not cold, not abusive, just carefully arranged. There were rules nobody explained, lines nobody crossed, and a quiet understanding about where I stood in the family. My older brother got things I didn't. Opportunities came easier to him. Decisions were made for me without ever being discussed. And every time something felt off, there was always one word that explained it away. Adopted. It was simple, clean, final. So I stopped asking questions. I stopped wondering. I built my life around the idea that I didn't fully belong and learned how to live with it. But at that wedding, when she looked at me and said those words, but it wasn't only the sentence that stayed with me. It was the way nobody asked what she meant. Because it wasn't just what she said. It was the way everyone else reacted. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just a story I'd been told. It was something they were all protecting. And what I did the next morning, the decision I made without telling anyone, that's what started tearing everything apart. Stay with me, because what happens next changes everything. For most of my life, I didn't think too hard about the word they used for me. Adopted. It was always there, quiet but constant, like background noise you stop noticing after a while. I didn't question it, not because I didn't care, but because every time I came close to asking something deeper, the room would shift in a way I couldn't explain back then. My mother would go still. My father would get quiet. And whatever I was about to say would suddenly feel wrong. So I learned early, some questions weren't worth asking. I grew up in a small town where people didn't just know your name, they knew your history. Or at least, the version of it that was told out loud. Ours was simple. They chose me. That's what my mother always said. "We chose you," she'd remind me, like it was something I should hold on to, something I should be grateful for. And I was. At least, I tried to be. But there's a difference between being loved and being placed. And even as a kid, I could feel that difference without having the words for it. My older brother never had to think about it. He belonged without explanation. Everything in our house seemed to orbit around him in ways that were subtle enough to deny, but obvious enough to feel. He got the bigger room. He got the attention when it mattered. And when choices had to be made, about money, time, or priorities, he was always the center of them. I was included, but never first. At the time, I told myself that was normal, that it made sense. Because I was the one who came later, the one who wasn't originally part of the plan. That belief filled in every gap. It explained every imbalance, every moment that felt just slightly off. And the thing is, it worked. For years, it worked. I built my life around that understanding. I did well in school, not for praise, but because I didn't want to be a problem. I learned how to take care of things myself, how to not need too much, how to stay just far enough out of the way to keep everything smooth. And eventually, that became who I was. Independent, reliable, low maintenance. The kind of person people don't worry about because you've trained them not to. But every now and then, something would slip through. A moment, a look, something small that didn't quite match the story I'd been given. Like the way certain relatives would study my face a little too long. Or how conversations would stop, just for a second, when I walked into the room. It was never obvious. Never enough to call out. Just enough to notice, and then second-guess myself for noticing it. So I ignored it. Because the alternative didn't make sense. The story was already complete. I was adopted. That was the explanation. End of discussion. Even when I got older, even when I started working in a field where I literally handled DNA reports and family histories every day, I never thought to question my own. That's the part that still gets me. I spent years helping other people uncover the truth about who they were, while never once looking at my own. Not because I couldn't, but because I thought I already had the answer. And when you believe you already know something, you stop looking for anything that might contradict it. Looking back now, there were signs. Too many to count, honestly. But they were scattered, disconnected. And without context, they didn't mean anything. Until the wedding. Until that moment. Until Aunt Marlene lifted her glass and said Martin's name in front of everyone. Until my mother froze. Until my father looked down like shame had weight. And until my brother stared at the floor like he had been carrying the answer for years. And the whole table went silent. Because it wasn't just what she said. It was the silence that followed. The way the air changed. The way people looked at each other instead of at me. Like something had been said out loud that was never supposed to be. And in that split second, something inside me locked into place. Not panic. Not confusion. Something quieter than that. Recognition. Like a piece of a puzzle I didn't know I was solving, had suddenly found where it belonged. I didn't react the way people probably expected me to. I didn't make a scene. I didn't ask questions. I just paid attention. Because for the first time in my life, the story I'd been given didn't feel solid anymore. It felt constructed. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. The drive home that night was quiet. Not uncomfortable. Not emotional. Just still. I remember watching the reflection of my own face in the window beside me. Trying to see what she saw. Trying to understand why those words landed the way they did. And the strangest part was, I wasn't scared. I wasn't even upset. I was focused. Because something in me had already decided what came next. I didn't say much when we got home. Didn't explain what I was thinking. Didn't ask for reassurance. I just went through the motions like everything was normal. Changed clothes. Washed my face. Sat on the edge of the bed for a few minutes longer than usual. And then I opened my laptop. Not dramatically. Not emotionally. Just deliberately. There was no hesitation. No second guessing. Because once the doubt was there, I knew exactly what I needed to do. Not to prove anyone wrong. Not to confront anyone. Just to see the truth for myself. Clean, clear, undeniable. The kind of truth that doesn't depend on what anyone says, or how they explain it. And as I sat there, cursor blinking on the screen, I realized something I hadn't expected. I wasn't hopping for a specific answer. I wasn't trying to confirm anything. I just wanted to know. Really know. For the first time in my life. Because whatever that result was, it would finally belong to me. And that was the moment everything actually started. Not the wedding. Not the words. This. The decision to stop accepting the version of my life that had been handed to me. And start looking at what was actually there. Because once you take that step, there's no going back to not knowing. And what showed up on my doorstep 3 days later was something small enough to hold in one hand, but powerful enough to dismantle everything I thought I understood about my family. The box arrived on a Monday morning. No signature required. No warning. Just a small, plain package sitting on my doorstep like it had always been meant to be there. If someone else had seen it, they wouldn't have thought twice. But I knew exactly what it was. I picked it up, felt the weight of it in my hand. Light. Too light, honestly, for something that could answer a question I'd unknowingly carried my entire life. I didn't open it right away. I brought it inside, set it on the kitchen counter, poured a cup of coffee I didn't really want, and just stood there, looking at it. Because up until that point, everything had still been theoretical. A possibility. A question. But once I opened that box, it stopped being a thought experiment. It became real. And real things don't stay contained. They move, they spread, they change everything around them. I knew that. So I gave myself a minute. Just one. To breathe in the version of my life that still made sense. Then I opened it. Inside, everything was exactly how I expected. Clinical, organized, simple. A swab, a tube, instructions that could be followed without thinking. I read them anyway. Not because I needed to, but because it slowed things down. Gave me something to focus on that wasn't the outcome. Swab the inside of your cheek for 60 seconds. 60 seconds. That's all it takes. I've processed enough tests to know that's not the hard part. The hard part is what comes after. I moved to the sink. Looked at my reflection for a second longer than usual. Tried to see something different. Something that would tell me what I was about to find. But my face looked the same. Familiar. Unchanged. And that almost made it harder. Because if everything looked the same on the outside, then whatever was about to shift would happen somewhere deeper. Somewhere I couldn't see. I did the swab. Slow, precise. Exactly the way I'd done it hundreds of times before for other people. Except this time, my hands felt different. Not shaky. Just aware. Every movement mattered more. Every second felt longer. When it was done, I sealed the tube. Placed it in the bag. Pressed it closed. Simple steps. Routine. But there was something about doing it for myself that made each one feel heavier. Like I was signing something I couldn't unsign. I set the kit down on the counter. Looked at it one more time. And then I picked up my keys. Because I didn't want it sitting there. Didn't want to give myself time to rethink it. Or worse, delay it. I drove straight to the post office. Didn't turn on the radio. Didn't check my phone. Just drove. The roads were quiet that morning. Normal traffic, normal pace. Everything outside the car looked exactly the way it always did. And that felt strange. Because inside the car, everything had already shifted. I dropped the package into the slot. Heard it land. A soft sound. Almost nothing. And just like that, it was out of my hands. There's a moment after you send something like that where time changes. It doesn't speed up. It doesn't slow down. It just becomes louder. Every hour feels more noticeable. Every thought circles back to the same place. I went to work like nothing had happened. Clocked in. Put on my gloves. Started processing samples. Blood panels, genetic screenings, routine cases. The same work I did every day. But this time, I couldn't disconnect from it. Every sample I touched meant something different. Every result I verified felt closer. Because I knew somewhere in the system, mine would be moving through it too. Not physically, but in the same way. Being processed. Being analyzed. Being turned into something final. At one point, I caught myself staring at a report longer than I should have. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I did. I understood exactly what those numbers meant. What they could confirm. What they could destroy. And for the first time, I wasn't just interpreting data. I was waiting for it to define me. The next few days didn't feel dramatic. No big moments. No sudden confrontations. Just small things. Subtle changes that didn't make sense on their own. But together, they started forming a pattern. My mother called me midweek. That alone was unusual. She wasn't someone who checked in without a reason. Her voice sounded lighter than usual. Almost careful. Like she was choosing her words more than she normally did. She asked how I was doing. What I'd been up to. Nothing specific. Nothing direct. But there was something underneath it. Something I couldn't quite place. At the time, I brushed it off. Told myself I was reading into it. But later that day, my brother texted me. Said the house felt weird. That things were being moved around. Closets being cleaned out. Old boxes being gone through for no clear reason. I read that message twice. Then a third time. Because suddenly, those small things didn't feel random anymore. They felt connected. Like something was already in motion before I even had my answer. And that's when the waiting changed. It stopped being passive. It started feeling like a countdown. Not just for me. For everyone. Because whatever the truth was, it wasn't just sitting quietly, waiting to be discovered. It was already affecting things. Already shifting behavior. Already pulling at threads I hadn't even seen yet. By the time the email came through, I wasn't surprised. Not in the way I thought I would be. My phone buzzed early in the morning. Before work. Before coffee. Just a notification. Simple. Your results are ready. I stared at the screen for a second. Then locked it. Set it face down on the table. Because opening it meant crossing a line I couldn't step back from. And I wanted one more moment. Where everything was still technically unknown. But that moment didn't last long. Because curiosity isn't something you can pause once it starts. I picked up the phone again. Unlocked it. Opened the email. Clicked the link. The page loaded slowly. Section by section. Like it was giving me time to process each part before moving to the next. But I didn't care about the early details. The percentages. The background. None of that mattered. There was only one section that did. And when it finally appeared, everything else disappeared with it. Because the name at the top of that result wasn't just unexpected. It was someone I had known my entire life. I didn't react right away. That's the part people expect to be dramatic. But it was. No sudden movement. No shock loud enough to hear. Just stillness. Because when something doesn't fit into any version of reality you've ever known, your brain doesn't reject it. It pauses. I read the name again. Slowly this time. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I needed to make sure I wasn't misreading something. The format was clear. There was no room for interpretation. The first result said, Martin Keller, 50% match, parent. I stared at the name. Martin wasn't a stranger. He was my father's younger brother. My uncle. Then I saw another match. Claire Dawson, 25% match, half-sibling. And below that, another name. Another child. Another life built around the same silence. That was when I understood. I wasn't the only one. And that changed the question completely. This wasn't only about who my father was. It was about how many lives had been shaped around the same lie. That wasn't a suggestion. That was a conclusion. For 30 years, the story had been wrong. Not incomplete. Not misunderstood. Wrong. I leaned back in the chair. Phone still in my hand. And for a few seconds, I didn't think about anything. No questions. No emotions. Just space. Because the truth didn't arrive all at once. It came in layers. And the first layer wasn't even about who that name belonged to. It was about what it meant. In a way that required intention. Planning. Consistency. Because something like this doesn't stay hidden for decades by accident. I sat up again. Scrolled. Because once you start looking, you can't stop halfway. I wasn't looking at a mistake. I was looking at a pattern. A family structure that I was already inside of. That's when the second realization hit. Not emotional. Not loud. Just precise. I hadn't been brought into this family from the outside. I had been born into it. And then repositioned. That word came to me immediately. Not hidden. Not lost. Repositioned. Placed somewhere specific. Given a role that explained everything, while revealing nothing. I set the phone down on the table. This time, a little harder than before. Not out of anger. Out of finality. Because there was no version of this where things went back to the way they were. Even if I never said a word. Even if I closed the app, deleted the results, pretended I hadn't seen it. I would still know. And knowing changes everything. I stood up. Walked to the sink. Ran the tap. Not because I needed water, but because I needed something normal to happen. Something routine. Something that didn't involve rethinking my entire identity. The sound of the water filled the silence. And for a second, it helped. Until the next thought came in. Clear. Unavoidable. If this is true, then everyone else already knows. That was the moment everything shifted. Because up until then, this had been personal. My result. My discovery. My reality changing. But that thought made it bigger. It turned it outward. Into something shared. Something held. Something maintained. And that changed the question completely. It was, what is the truth? It became, who's been protecting it? I dried my hands slowly. Turned off the tap. Looked at my reflection again. Same face. Same eyes. Same expression. But now, I knew what I was looking at. And that knowledge sat differently. Not heavy. Not overwhelming. Just clear. I went back to the table. Picked up the phone again. Scrolled further. Because if there was one answer, there were more. And I needed to see all of them. That's when I found the third match. Another 50% connection. Different name. Same classification. Which meant only one thing. This wasn't a single secret. It was a system. One truth doesn't create multiple hidden relationships like that. But a pattern does. A repeated decision. The kind that gets easier every time it's made. I stared at that second name for a long time. Because unlike the first one, this one didn't belong to anyone I recognized. And that opened a completely different door. Not just who lied, but how far it went. Because if there was someone else out there, connected to me in the exact same way, then this wasn't contained. It wasn't limited to one moment. One mistake. It stretched beyond the boundaries of the life I thought I understood. I sat back down. Slower this time. Because now there was more to process. More than just identity. More than just truth. There were people. Unknown variables. Connections I hadn't even considered. And suddenly, this wasn't just about looking backward. It was about what existed outside of what I'd been told. I opened the profile linked to that second match. Minimal information. Basic details. Location. Age range. Enough to confirm the connection, but not enough to explain it. I hesitated. Not for long, but long enough to recognize it. Because reaching out would make this real in a completely different way. It would turn data into conversation, into voice, into someone else experiencing the same shift I was. But I already knew I wasn't going to ignore it. Because if I had learned anything in the past few days, it was that avoiding the truth doesn't make it smaller. It just delays what happens when it finally surfaces. So I typed a message. Kept it simple. Direct. No assumptions. No emotion. Just an opening. And then I sent it. No second guessing. No editing. Just done. I set the phone down again. Sat there for a moment. And for the first time since opening the results, I felt something close to anticipation. Not fear. Not anxiety. Something quieter. Because now, I wasn't just waiting for answers. I had already found them. Now I was waiting to see how far they reached. And whether someone else had been waiting for the same thing. And when the reply came back, it didn't just confirm what I had found. It proved this wasn't a one-time secret. The reply came faster than I expected. Not hours later. Not the next day. Minutes. My phone buzzed while it was still sitting on the table, screen lighting up in the same quiet kitchen where everything had just changed. I didn't rush to pick it up. I looked at it first. Because somehow, I already knew this wasn't going to be a casual response. Not curiosity. Not confusion. Something else. I picked up the phone. Opened the message. And the first line told me everything I needed to know. I've been waiting for this. I read it twice. Then a third time. Because those weren't the words of someone surprised by a random connection. Those were the words of someone who already suspected something and had been living with that uncertainty long before I ever pressed order. I replied. Simple again. Direct. We moved quickly from messages to a call. No hesitation on either side. Because whatever this was, it mattered to both of us in a way that didn't need explanation. Her voice was calm. Measured. The kind of calm that doesn't come from comfort, but from practice. Like she had learned how to talk about things without letting them take over. We didn't start with introductions. Not in the normal way. No small talk. No background details. Just alignment. She already knew what the connection meant. She just needed confirmation. And I already had it. We compared what we knew. Piece by piece. Carefully. Because once you start putting something like this together, you don't rush it. You verify. You cross-check. You make sure what you're seeing isn't just coincidence. But there wasn't any room for coincidence here. The numbers matched. The structure matched. And eventually, the conclusion did too. Same father. Different lives. Different stories. Same silence. She had grown up believing something completely different. Not adoption. Absence. A father who left before she was born. A story that explained everything, without revealing anything. Different version. Same purpose. To simplify something that was never simple. As she spoke, I realized something that hadn't fully registered before. This wasn't just about what I had been told. It was about what everyone had been told. Different narratives. Different explanations. All designed to protect the same truth. Or maybe to protect the same people. She told me she had taken her test years ago. Searching. Trying to fill in a gap that had always been there. But back then, nothing came up. No clear connections. No answers. Just partial data. Enough to confirm something was missing, but not enough to define it. Until now. Until my result connected the structure. Linked the pieces. Turned separate questions into the same answer. There was a pause in the conversation. Not uncomfortable. Just heavy. Because now we both understood the scale of it. This wasn't one hidden detail. It wasn't one decision that got buried over time. It was repeated. Maintained. Sustained across years. And that kind of consistency doesn't happen by accident. It requires awareness. Participation. Silence from more than one person. That's when she said something that stayed with me. This wasn't a mistake, she said quietly. This was managed. The word landed immediately. Because it fit. Too well. Everything about it felt controlled. Structured. Like someone had built a version of reality that everyone else was expected to live inside, without ever questioning the foundation. And the more we talked, the clearer it became. We weren't uncovering something new. We were stepping into something that had always been there. Just hidden in plain sight. I asked her if she had ever met anyone from that side of the family. She hadn't. Not knowingly. No accidental encounters. No unexplained familiarity. Nothing. Her entire life had been built without any visible connection to the people I had grown up around. And yet, we were connected in the most direct way possible. It was strange to think about. Two lives running parallel. Close enough to intersect, but never doing it. Until now. We spoke for longer than I expected. Not because we had answers, but because we had questions. And for the first time, we could ask them out loud without being shut down. Without being redirected. Without being made to feel like we were overstepping something. That alone felt different. But eventually, the conversation shifted. From understanding what had happened to deciding what to do with it. Because knowing something like this comes with a choice. You can leave it where it is. Keep it contained. Let it exist quietly. Or you can bring it into the light and accept everything that comes with that. I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know, but because I wanted to hear how it sounded when I said it out loud. I'm not keeping this quiet. The words felt steady, not emotional, not reactive, just certain. There was a brief silence on the other end. Then she exhaled. Slow, measured. I didn't think you would, she said. And that told me everything I needed to know. She had already made the same decision. Maybe not in the exact same way, but in the same direction. Because once something like this becomes clear, silence stops feeling neutral. It starts feeling like participation. We didn't make a plan right then, didn't map out steps or timelines, but something had already been set in motion. Because now there were two of us, two people with the same evidence, the same connection, the same reason to stop accepting what we'd been told. And that changes things. It changes the balance. It changes the outcome. Because one person can be dismissed, explained away, ignored. But two becomes harder to contain, harder to control, harder to rewrite. By the time we ended the call, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't going to stay quiet. Not this time. Because the next step wasn't about finding more answers. It was about confronting the people who had been hiding them and seeing what they would do when they realized the truth was already out. I didn't go to them right away. That would have been the obvious move. Confrontation. Questions. Demanding answers before they had time to prepare. But something about that didn't feel right. Not because I was afraid of what they'd say, but because I already knew how they operated. Careful, controlled. Always one step ahead of the conversation. If I walked in with nothing but questions, they'd give me explanations. And explanations can be shaped, adjusted, rewritten in real time. I didn't want that. I wanted something they couldn't change. Something fixed, documented, independent of whatever story they tried to tell. So instead of confronting them, I went back to the place where everything had always been kept. The house. I hadn't been there in a few days. Not since before the test. Before the results. Before everything started shifting. When I walked in, nothing looked different. Same furniture. Same layout. Same quiet sense of order that had always been there. But now, I saw it differently. Because once you know something is hidden, every familiar space starts to feel like it's holding something. I didn't announce what I was doing. Didn't ask permission. I kept it simple. Said I needed to grab something. Something vague enough not to raise immediate questions, but normal enough not to seem suspicious. They didn't stop me. That was the first sign. Because if everything had been exactly the way they claimed, there wouldn't have been anything to protect. But there was a hesitation. Subtle. Easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. And now, I was looking for everything. I went straight to the hallway. The one with the closet that hadn't changed in years. The one that held everything nobody needed often, but never threw away. Seasonal boxes. Old documents. Things that had been filed away long enough to feel permanent. I opened the door. The smell hit first. Paper, dust, time. Nothing unusual. But this time, it felt different. Because I wasn't just looking through storage. I was looking for proof. I reached up to the top shelf. There were boxes I recognized immediately. holiday decorations, old photo albums, the kind of things that get moved around, but never actually opened. And behind them, something else. Not obvious. Not placed for easy access. Pushed slightly back, like it wasn't meant to be seen unless you knew to look for it. That's the thing about hiding something long-term. You don't make it invisible. You make it forgettable. I pulled the boxes forward. Carefully. Not rushing. Because the moment you move too quickly, you risk missing something. And whatever this was, I wasn't going to overlook it. There it was. A sealed envelope. Worn edges. Aged just enough to tell me it had been sitting there for a long time. Not recently placed. Not newly hidden. Stored. Preserved. I held it in my hands for a second. Felt the weight. Heavier than the test kit. Not physically, but in what it represented. Because this wasn't data. This was history. I sat down on the edge of the bed. The same room I'd been in 100 times before. Now feeling completely unfamiliar. I opened it slowly. Not because I was nervous, but because I understood what I was about to see. Inside, there wasn't much. No official paperwork. No formal documents. Nothing that matched the story I had been told my entire life. No adoption records. No legal confirmations. Nothing. That absence said more than anything else could have. Because if the story had been real, there would have been something to support it. Instead, there was only one document. A birth certificate. I looked at it carefully. Not quickly. Not emotionally. The same way I look at any record that matters. Name. Date. Location. All correct. All consistent. Until I reached the part that mattered. Mother's name. Exactly what I expected. No surprise there. But the line below it was blank. No father listed. I stared at that space longer than I needed to. Because that blank line wasn't an omission. It was a decision. Something had been left out. Intentionally. And once you recognize that, you can't pretend it's accidental. I placed the certificate down. Carefully. Because there was still one more piece. A single sheet. Folded. Handwritten. Not formal. Not official. But clear. Direct. The kind of document that doesn't exist unless someone needs it to. I unfolded it. Read the first line. And immediately understood what I was holding. It wasn't just an explanation. It was instructions. Not about what happened, but about what to say. How to present it. How to keep it consistent. A version of events designed to be repeated. Maintained. Passed along without question. And suddenly, everything made sense. The repetition. The consistency. The way the same explanation had been delivered, over and over again without variation. It hadn't been natural. It had been rehearsed. I read the entire page. Twice. Then once more. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I wanted to be certain. Certain that what I was seeing matched what I had already found. And it did. Perfectly. Data. Documentation. Alignment. 3 separate sources. All pointing to the same conclusion. For 30 years, I had called the wrong man Dad. And the man who knew the truth had been standing beside us at birthdays, Christmas dinners, and school graduations, saying nothing. Because for the first time, there was nothing left to interpret, nothing left to question. The story I had been given wasn't just incomplete. It had been constructed, deliberately, maintained over time, supported by silence. I folded the paper back the way I found it, placed everything exactly where it had been. Not out of respect, out of precision, because I didn't need to take anything with me. I already had what I needed. I walked out of the room, down the hallway, past the same walls that had held that version of my life for years. And as I reached the door, I realized something important. The next step wasn't about finding anything else. It was about what I was going to do with what I already knew. I didn't go to my mother first. I went to Martin, my father's younger brother. The man who fixed my bike. The man who taught me to drive. The man who stood beside my parents in every family photo. And according to the DNA test, the man who was actually my father. His workshop sat just outside town. It was quiet when I got there. The kind of quiet that feels normal until you're carrying something that is. I parked, sat in the car for a second, not hesitating, just preparing. Because this wasn't a conversation I could ease into. And I didn't want to. I got out, walked up to the door, pushed it open. The sound of tools stopped almost immediately. He looked up. Same expression I'd seen 100 times before. Familiar. Relaxed. Unaware. And for a split second, I saw him the way I always had. Just him. But that didn't last. Because now, I knew what I was walking in with. I didn't say anything right away. I walked in, set the paper down on the nearest surface. Not aggressively. Not dramatically. Just clearly. His eyes moved to it. Then back to me. Then down again. And in that moment, before a single word was spoken, I saw it. Recognition. Not confusion. Not surprise. Recognition. That was all I needed. How long? I asked. My voice was steady. Even. The same tone I'd used 100 times when asking for clarification on something that didn't add up. He didn't answer immediately. He sat down slowly. Like the weight of the question had already settled in before he even tried to respond. And then silence. Not empty. Not unsure. Just full. Full of everything that hadn't been said for years. I didn't repeat the question. I didn't need to. Because at this point, it wasn't about getting information. It was about watching what he chose to do with it. Finally, he spoke. Since the beginning. No hesitation. No attempt to soften it. Just the truth. Direct. Unfiltered. And that hit differently than I expected. Not because it was shocking, but because it confirmed something I had already started to understand. This hadn't been a secret that developed over time. It had been there from the start. Which meant every interaction, every moment, every memory had existed alongside that knowledge. I let that settle for a second. Then I asked the next question. Not emotional. Not reactive. Just necessary. Why? That was the one thing I didn't already have. The part that data can't give you. The part that only people can explain. He leaned forward. Hands together. Eyes not quite meeting mine. Not avoiding, just careful. And when he spoke, it wasn't rushed. It wasn't defensive. It was measured. Like he had thought about this before. like he had replayed it enough times to know exactly what he was going to say, if this moment ever came. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he said. I didn't respond, because that wasn't an answer. That was an introduction, a way to step into something without fully standing in it. He continued. There were explanations, timing, circumstances, situations that made it easier to understand without actually changing what had been done. And I listened, not because I needed to believe any of it, but because I needed to hear it, to see if there was anything in it that justified the outcome. There was. Not really. Because no explanation, no matter how detailed, can undo a decision that was carried forward for decades. Especially when that decision affected more than just the people who made it. I let him finish. Didn't interrupt. Didn't challenge. Because the truth is, this part wasn't about proving anything. That had already been done. This was about something else. Responsibility. And whether he was willing to take it, now that it couldn't be avoided. "So what now?" I asked. That question changed everything, because it moved the conversation forward. Out of the past, into the present, into something that required action, not reflection. He hesitated, and that hesitation said more than anything else had. Because it showed me something important. He didn't have a plan. Not for this. Not for what happens when the truth stops being hidden. Which meant, whatever came next wasn't something he had prepared for. And that gave me clarity. Because if he didn't know what to do, then I did. "I'm not keeping this quiet," I said. Same tone. Same delivery. No emphasis. No escalation. Just a statement. He looked up at me then. Fully. For the first time since I walked in. And there was something in his expression that hadn't been there before. Not denial. Not confusion. Something closer to consequence. Because in that moment, he understood what I had already decided. And more importantly, he understood that I wasn't going to change it. There was a pause. Longer this time. Because now, there was nothing left to explain. Nothing left to soften. Just the reality of what was about to happen. And the part he was going to play in it. "I'll tell them," he said. The words came out slower than the others. Less certain. But still intentional. I held his gaze for a second. Then shook my head. "No," I said quietly. "Not this time. Because this wasn't something that could be managed anymore. Not shaped. Not controlled. Not delivered in a way that protected anyone involved. This needed to be seen. Clearly. Completely. By everyone who had been part of it. And for the first time since I walked in. He didn't argue. He didn't push back. He didn't try to redirect. He just nodded. Like he understood. Like somewhere, he knew this was inevitable. I picked up the paper. Turned toward the door. And as I walked out, I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel overwhelmed. I felt resolved. Because the hardest part, finding the truth, was already behind me. Now, it was about what came next. And what happened when I finally faced my mother. Wasn't denial. It was something far more calculated. I didn't wait long before going to her. Not this time. Because after that conversation, there wasn't anything left to prepare for. I already had the truth. I already had confirmation. Now I needed to see how she would respond when there was nothing left to hide behind. She was in the kitchen when I walked in. Same place she'd always been. Same routine. Wiping down the counter in slow, circular motions, like she could smooth out anything that didn't belong. For a second, I just watched, because it struck me how normal it all looked. How easily someone could walk into that room and never suspect anything was wrong. But I wasn't someone anymore. I stepped forward, set the paper down on the counter, right in front of her. Not aggressively, not forcefully, just directly. She looked at it, then at me, then back at it again. And in that moment, everything I needed to know was already there. Not shock, not confusion, recognition. Same as before, just faster, more contained. She didn't ask what it was, didn't question where it came from. She already knew. And instead of responding immediately, she did something I hadn't expected. She kept wiping the counter. Slow, deliberate, like she was finishing something before allowing anything else to begin. That was the first sign. This wasn't going to be emotional. It was going to be controlled, calculated. She set the cloth down, turned to face me, and her expression was exactly the same one I'd seen my entire life whenever something needed to be managed. Calm, measured, ready. "You shouldn't have gone looking for things like this," she said. "Not what is this. Not that isn't true. Just that." Like the betrayal was not what they had done. It was that I had finally found it. Not denial. Not surprise. Instruction. Like the problem wasn't what I found, but the fact that I chose to look for it at all. I didn't respond right away, because that told me something important. She wasn't going to argue the truth. She was going to reposition it, frame it in a way that shifted responsibility away from her and onto me. "I didn't go looking," I said evenly. "I verified." That word landed. I saw it. Because verification doesn't leave room for interpretation. It doesn't open the door for explanation. It closes it. She inhaled slowly, exhaled the same way. And then she changed direction. Vast. Like flipping a switch. "I was young," she said. "I didn't know what to do." There it was. The explanation. Not as a defense, but as context. As something meant to soften the edges of what had been done. I listened. Didn't interrupt. Because I needed to see where she would take it. There were reasons. Circumstances. Moments in time that made everything sound complicated enough to justify the decision, without actually addressing the impact of it. And as she spoke, I realized something. She wasn't trying to convince me. She was trying to control the outcome, trying to guide the conversation toward a version of the truth that still allowed her to maintain something. Reputation, stability, control. And that's when she shifted again. "You have no idea what this will do," she said, her voice tightening slightly. "To the family, to everything we've built." That was the second tactic. Consequence. Not for what had happened, but for what would happen if it was exposed. The focus wasn't on the past. It was on the fallout. And who would be responsible for it. I met her gaze. Didn't raise my voice. Didn't change my tone. Because this wasn't about reacting. It was about clarity. "This didn't start with me," I said. That was it. Simple. Direct. And it stopped her. Not completely, but enough. Because there wasn't a way to redirect that. There wasn't a way to shift it. The origin of all of this was already established. And it wasn't mine. She tried one more time. Different approach. Softer. More personal. I did what I had to do, she said quietly. To protect everything. And for a second, there it was. The closest thing to honesty she had offered. Not because it justified anything, but because it revealed intent. This had never been about confusion or uncertainty. It had been about choice. A decision made once, and then upheld over and over again. I let the silence sit. Didn't fill it. Didn't push. Because sometimes, the absence of response says more than anything else could. Finally, I spoke. I gave you time. That was the part she hadn't expected. Because this wasn't happening immediately. This wasn't impulsive. There had been space. Opportunity. A chance for this to come from her instead of being pulled out. And she had chosen not to use it. Her expression shifted. Not dramatically. Just slightly. Because now, she understood something she hadn't before. This wasn't reversible. Not through explanation. Not through emotion. Not through control. It had already moved past that point. You don't have to do this, she said. Last attempt. Not forceful. Not demanding. Just persuasive. Like there was still a possibility of containing it. Keeping it inside the version of reality she had built. I shook my head. I do. And that was the moment everything settled. Not escalated. Settled. Because there was no more movement left. No more negotiation. No more positioning. Just the truth. And what was going to happen with it. She didn't argue after that. Didn't try to stop me. Didn't follow me when I picked up the paper and turned toward the door. Because she already knew. Just like he had. This wasn't something she could control anymore. And as I walked out, I realized something else. The hardest conversations weren't the ones filled with emotion. They were the ones where everything was already understood. And nothing could be undone. And by the time Sunday came, everyone already knew something was coming. They just didn't know how much was about to be exposed. By the time Sunday came, the atmosphere had already changed. Nobody said it out loud. Nobody needed to. You could feel it the moment you stepped into the house. The same space that had always felt structured, predictable, controlled, now carried something underneath it. Tension. Quiet, contained. But present. Everyone was there. Exactly where they were supposed to be. The same seats. Same routine. Same table that had held years of conversations that never touched what actually mattered. I walked in with everything I needed. Not just mentally. Physically. Organized. Prepared. Because this wasn't a discussion. It was a reveal. I took my usual seat. Didn't rush. Didn't announce anything. Let the routine play out the way it always did. Food was passed around. Small talk filled the space. Conversations that sounded normal, but felt forced. Like everyone was aware something was coming. But no one knew when it would start. I watched. Listened. Not to what was being said, but to what wasn't. Because silence tells you more than words ever do. And there was a lot of it. Gaps in conversation. Glances that didn't last long enough to be obvious, but long enough to be noticed. Nobody was relaxed. Not really. They were waiting. They just didn't know for what. I let it go on longer than expected. Because timing matters in moments like this. You don't interrupt too early. You don't force attention. You let it settle until everyone is exactly where they think they're safe. Then you shift it. I set my fork down. That was all it took. The sound was small, but it cut through everything. Conversation stopped. Not instantly, but quickly enough. Eyes turned, one by one, until the entire table was looking at me. And in that moment, everything became very simple. I need to say something, I said. No hesitation. No build-up. Just clarity. There was immediate resistance. Subtle, but there. A shift in posture. A tightening of expression. Because even without knowing what I was about to say, they knew it wasn't going to stay inside the lines they were used to. It won't take long, I added. That wasn't reassurance. It was control. Because I wasn't asking for permission. I reached down and pulled the folder onto the table. Set it in the center, where everyone could see it. I didn't open it yet. I just let it sit there. Visible. Present. And that's when the reactions started. Small at first. A glance exchanged. A shift in someone's seat. The kind of movement people make when they're trying to stay composed while preparing for something they can't predict. I opened the folder. Slowly. Deliberately. Because this wasn't about shock. It was about certainty. I took a DNA test, I said. That landed. Harder than expected. Because it removed all ambiguity. This wasn't speculation. This wasn't emotion. This was evidence. I pulled out the first page. Placed it on the table. Turned it so everyone could see. The results are clear, I continued. Still calm. Still controlled. No change in tone. Because tone is what people react to. And I wasn't giving them anything to push back against. My biological father. I paused. Not for effect. For precision. Is not who I was told. There it was. The line that broke the structure. You could feel it. Not in sound. In stillness. Because once that sentence exists, everything built on top of the original story starts to collapse. Someone spoke. Quickly. Trying to interrupt. Trying to redirect. But I didn't stop. I didn't acknowledge it. Because once you lose control of the moment, it turns back into a conversation. And this wasn't one. I placed the next page down. Aligned it with the first. Here is the confirmation, I said. No emphasis. No explanation. Just data. Numbers. Percentages. Relationships. Unarguable. And then I said the name. Martin is my biological father. My mother closed her eyes. My father pushed back from the table. And Martin didn't say a word. That silence confirmed more than any DNA test ever could. Not the kind you fill. The kind that holds. Because everyone at that table understood what that meant. Not just the words, but the implications. The history. The years behind it. Someone stood up. Chair scraping against the floor. Another voice. Louder this time. Confused, defensive. But it didn't matter. Because the structure had already broken. And once it breaks, You can't rebuild it fast enough to contain what's coming next. I reached into the folder again, pulled out the second set of results, placed them next to the first. There's more, I said. That's when everything shifted. Because one truth can sometimes be explained, reframed, minimized. But two creates a pattern. And patterns are harder to deny. This isn't just about me, I continued. And then I said it. Clearly. Directly. No hesitation. There is another connection. That's when the room changed completely. Not tension anymore. Not uncertainty. Recognition. Because at that point, everyone knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a mistake. It was something that had been carried, maintained, protected, for years. And now it was out. Fully. Irreversibly. I didn't raise my voice. Didn't push. Didn't argue. Because I didn't need to. The truth doesn't require force. It just needs to be seen. And in that moment, everyone saw it. Exactly as it was. No filters. No control. No version of it that could be adjusted to make it easier to accept. Just reality. Sitting in the middle of the table, where it had never been allowed to exist before. And what happened next wasn't an explosion. It was something much quieter and far more permanent. What happened next wasn't loud. No one started yelling. No one flipped the table. There wasn't a single moment you could point to and say, that's when everything broke. Because the truth is, it didn't break all at once. It separated. Quietly. Piece by piece. The first thing that disappeared was certainty. You could see it on their faces. The way people looked at each other, not for answers, but for confirmation. Like maybe someone else would explain it in a way that made more sense. That restored something. But no one did. Because there wasn't a version of this that fixed itself. The second thing that disappeared was alignment. People who had always stood on the same side of every conversation suddenly didn't. Not openly. Not dramatically. But you could feel it. In the hesitation. In the way responses came slower. Less confident. Because now, everyone was calculating. Reassessing. Trying to understand where they stood in something they thought they already understood. And then came the reactions. Not all at once. Not in order. Just individually. One person tried to dismiss it. Not aggressively. Just enough to suggest there might be another explanation. Something missing. Something misunderstood. But even as they said it, you could hear the lack of conviction. Because the evidence was there. Visible. Structured. Clear. Another person didn't speak at all. Just sat there. Still. Eyes fixed on the table. Like looking up would force them to accept something they weren't ready to process yet. And then there were the questions. Not directed at me. Directed at each other. Short. Sharp. Fragments of conversations that had never happened before, suddenly being forced into the open. How long? Did you know? Why wasn't? None of them finished. They didn't need to be. Because the answers were already implied. And the more those questions surfaced, the more everything shifted. Because once people start asking the right questions, the structure that kept everything in place stops working. I didn't interrupt. I didn't guide the conversation. I didn't defend anything. Because this wasn't about convincing them. It was about letting them see. Letting them process it in real time. Without interference. Without control. And eventually, the focus came back to me. Not with anger. Not immediately. With something else. Responsibility. Not for what had happened, but for what was happening now. Because in that moment, I was the one who brought it into the open. And that changes how people see you. Even if what you brought was the truth. You didn't have to do this here. The words came quietly. Measured. Not confrontational. But loaded. Because underneath them was the implication that this could have been handled differently. Privately. Controlled. Contained. I met their gaze. Didn't respond right away. Because I wanted the silence to sit there. To carry the weight of what had just been said. Then I answered. It already happened here. Simple. Direct. Because this table, this room, had been part of the story long before I ever spoke. This wasn't a disruption. It was a correction. And that shifted something again. Not outwardly, but internally. Because once that perspective is introduced, it's harder to frame the truth as the problem. The room went quiet again. Different this time. Not tense. Not waiting. Just changed. Like something had been removed. And nothing had replaced it yet. People started pulling back. Not physically. Emotionally. Conversation stopped. Eye contact broke. Because once something like this is out, there's no script for what comes next. No familiar structure to fall back on. And without that, people don't know how to act. Eventually, chairs moved. Slowly. Not all at once. Just one, then another. The kind of movement that signals the end of something without announcing it. Nobody said it. Nobody needed to. The gathering was over. Not officially. But completely. I didn't rush out. I didn't make a statement. I didn't wait for anyone to say anything else. Because there was nothing left to say. Everything that mattered had already been placed on the table. Literally. And now it belonged to everyone. Not just me. Not just them. Everyone. That's what truth does. Once it's out, it stops being owned by one person. It becomes shared. And shared truths have consequences. Not always immediate. Not always visible. But permanent. I picked up the folder. Closed it. Held it in my hands for a second. Not because I needed to check anything, but because it represented something now. Not just answers. Closure. Clarity. Ownership. Things I hadn't had before. And as I walked toward the door, I didn't feel what I expected to feel. No relief. No satisfaction. No sense of victory. Just stillness. Because this wasn't about winning. It was about ending something that had been going on for far too long. And endings don't always feel good. They just feel final. And what happened in the weeks after that day changed more than just how people saw each other. It changed who stayed and who didn't. The weeks after that day didn't unfold all at once. There wasn't a single moment where everything collapsed. It happened gradually. Quietly. Like something that had been held together for too long, finally letting go. The first change was distance. Not dramatic. Not announced. Just space. People stopped calling as often. Messages became shorter, less frequent. Not cold, just careful. Because when something shifts at that level, everyone needs time to figure out what's still intact and what is. I didn't chase it. I didn't try to repair anything. Not because I didn't care, but because for the first time, I wasn't responsible for holding everything together. That role had never actually been mine. It just felt like it was. Some people reached out, not to argue, not to deny, just to understand. Those conversations were different, quieter, more honest. Because, without the structure of the original story, there was nothing left to defend, only things to process. Others didn't. They pulled back completely. Not out of anger, out of discomfort. Because facing something like that means reevaluating more than just one relationship. It means questioning everything that was built around it. And not everyone is ready for that. The family itself didn't end. Not in a clear, defined way. It just changed shape. Some connections held. Others didn't. And the ones that remained felt different, less automatic, more intentional. Because now, they weren't based on assumptions. They were based on choice. That's a big difference. The conversations that followed in the weeks after weren't loud. There were no dramatic confrontations. No big moments of closure. Just reality. Unfolding. People adjusting. Repositioning themselves around something that couldn't be undone. I saw it in small ways. The way people spoke more carefully. The way certain topics were avoided, not out of secrecy anymore, but out of awareness. Because once something is exposed, you don't forget it. You just learn how to live with it. As for me, things became simpler. Not easier. Simpler. Because for the first time, I wasn't operating inside a version of my life that had been defined by someone else. I didn't have to explain gaps that didn't make sense. Didn't have to rationalize things that never fully added up. I just existed inside the truth. And that changes how you move, how you think, how you see everything around you. I stopped trying to fit into spaces that were built on something incomplete. Stopped adjusting myself to match expectations that were never actually about me. Because once you understand the foundation, you stop blaming yourself for how things were structured. That was the biggest shift. Not the revelation. Not the confrontation. Ownership. Of my story. Of my identity. Of what I chose to do with it moving forward. The connection I found didn't disappear. It grew. Slowly. Naturally. Because unlike everything else, it wasn't built on something hidden. It was built on truth from the start. And that made it different. Stronger in a way that didn't need explanation. Didn't need to be justified. It just was. As for the people who had been part of the original story, they had their own process, their own consequences, their own adjustments to make. And I let them have that. Without interference. Without expectation. Because this wasn't about fixing what had been done. It was about moving forward from it. On my terms. The house still exists. The table still stands. Everything physically looks the same. But it is. Not anymore. Because once the truth is part of something, it changes how that space feels. Even in silence. Even when nothing is being said. I still go back sometimes. Not often. not out of obligation, just occasionally. And when I do, I don't feel like I'm stepping into something that defines me. I feel like I'm stepping into something I understand completely. And that difference is everything. I used to think that knowing the truth would be overwhelming, that it would create more questions than answers, that it would complicate things beyond repair. But it didn't. It clarified them. Because the hardest part isn't discovering something new. It's realizing that what you've always believed wasn't real. And once you get past that, everything else becomes easier to navigate. Not simple, not perfect, but real. And real is something you can actually work with, something you can build on, something that belongs to you. I don't regret finding out. Not for a second. Because even though it changed everything, it gave me something I didn't have before. The ability to see my life clearly. Without filters. Without assumptions. Without someone else deciding what parts I was allowed to understand. And that is worth everything it cost. For 30 years, I thought being adopted explained why I never fully belonged. But I wasn't adopted. I was hidden in plain sight. And the hardest part wasn't learning who my real father was. It was realizing everyone else already knew. And still let me grow up feeling like the outsider.